All right, well, let's get underway. And this is just a kind of we probably won't need the normal length of time we spend, but it's a chance for us to get our heads around Holy Week. And I don't want you looking ahead, but I have got just a little handout that's got the slides that might prove to be a useful memory aid later on. So we're about to go into Holy Week. As we know, the major sort of highlights of Holy Week that everybody's aware of course, are Palm Sunday, Good Friday, Easter Day, and then depending how well you've got a sense of the church's year and so on, then the Maundy Thursday celebration. And that's probably Maundy Thursday is the one which has suffered most in recent years, because for many people it now falls during school holidays, and that has really changed what people are doing over the Easter weekend. But we're going to see there's a lot more to Holy Week than just Palm Sunday, Maundy Thursday, Good Friday and Easter Day. I'm not worrying so much about like the historical stuff, but when did Jesus die, where did it happen, those sort of questions. I'm looking more at how we celebrate Holy Week, what the week looks like for us. Now, putting that in context, of course, we've got the whole church year, and Holy Week is just this little slice down here. So we're just coming out of Lent. The pink one is on Mothering Sunday. Then we go into Holy Week, and then we go into a period of either white or gold or yellow through Easter, through to Trinity Sunday, and then we go back into the green, of course. So we've got this overall spread. So we're looking at what's happening in that week, in Holy Week, which is one part of the church year. And another way of looking at it is this graphic, which sort of nicely divides up. The first half of the church year is telling the story of Jesus. Advent, Christmas, baptism of Jesus, temptations, Lent, of course, Palm Sunday, Holy Week, Easter, and so on. So the first one part of the year is very much focused on the Jesus story, or the story of Jesus. Then the rest of the year, the long green season, that goes basically from Pentecostal Trinity Sunday through to Christ the King at the end of the year. Then we're talking about the story of the people of God. So the first half of the year is Jesus' time, as it were. Second half of the year is our time. And again, Holy Week is just one tiny sliver, the very last part of Lent. Yeah, feel free to kind of say, what about, or ask any questions. The next thing, and this is a really boring slide, it's just going to have a couple of words on it, but it's just to remind us what we're doing when we gather for a liturgy. One of the things we do this a lot, is that we're remembering something that was said or done, parable, healing, an exorcism, whatever, and we're reading the story about it. So that's all we're doing. But we do that a lot. That's most of the times when we gather. Sometimes there are events that are more like commemorations, and where we're not so much telling the story of what happened as marking the fact that something has happened. And I guess outside of church, Anzac Day is a good example of that. Anzac Day, we're not simply telling the story, although that's usually included, but Anzac is about a commemoration, and All Souls Day is a commemoration. So fairly often when we're gathering for liturgy, we're remembering something from the past, we're reading the story, we're hearing about it again. Occasionally, the event is more focused on let's commemorate such and such. I suppose in some ways Christmas is very much in that category as well. At Christmas, and I'll bring up the next word is reenact. So at Christmas we don't reenact the birth of Jesus in church. Okay, we commemorate it with a big festival, and of course we remember it and we read the stories. But except for the Christmas pageant type moments, we're not reenacting the story. And even the pageant is really more in the it's just a way of remembering and telling the story. When we get into Holy Week, we're getting more into reenactment. So Holy Week has all the other bits there. We do remember what happened. We do read the passages. We are marking, the anniversaries, as it were, of Palm Sunday and Good Friday and so on. But there's a degree of reenactment in Holy Week. Not strictly reenactment, unless you're a Filipino Catholic, in which case we'll actually crucify some parishioners as part of the Good Friday service. It's always on the evening news.
It's voluntary.
On Good Friday. It's voluntary. But, there are traditions in the church which take reenactment very seriously. And for the Filipino Catholic community, being chosen on the roster, not to do morning tea, but to be crucified as part of the liturgy for Good Friday, like you've made it when Kay puts you on the crucifixion roster. Okay, you've really made it. Now, of course, they don't really nail them; they tie them with rope and so on. Okay. So, but if you think about Palm Sunday, there's a little bit of reenactment there. We wave palm branches. We don't just read about the palm branches. We don't just say, well, this is the day, we're commemorating the day when it happened. We do a little bit of reenacting. We're Anglicans, so we don't wave, we just wave a little palm branch, a little bit. Okay? Maundy Thursday, we reenact the foot washing. So we're doing more than simply commemorating, we're doing more than remembering. So Holy Week is the time in the year when we're more likely to be almost reenacting and acting out some of the things we're reading about and some of the things we're commemorating. So it's where we get closer to reenactment. We're not going to actually bury anybody, but we could take this really seriously. So remembering, commemorating, reenactment. Holy Week is when there's a little bit more of a reenactment in the mix, as it were. So as we said, the big days that everybody is kind of aware of are Palm Sunday, Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, of course, Holy Saturday, also known as, in secular language, increasingly it's called Easter Saturday because it's the Saturday on the Easter weekend. Strictly speaking, it's Easter Eve. We haven't gotten to Easter yet. And then, of course, there's Easter Day, which whoever made this slide is calling Easter Sunday. Well, again, that's the sort of popular way of talking about it. It's simply Easter Day, like Christmas Day, Easter Day. But the difference is Easter Day always falls on a Sunday. Christmas can be a Monday, a Tuesday, a Saturday, a Sunday, whatever. But Easter always falls on a Sunday. So we'll work our way through these and see how this kind of pattern developed, but we'll also think about Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and just kind of how Holy Week came to be the shape that it is. So, not only is this a time when we're more likely to be reenacting some of the events of Jesus' life, like some parishes will have a Passover Seder meal, either on Wednesday night or Thursday night, because they're going to reenact some of the Jewish rituals that would have happened in that week. It's also it's the time in the gospel story when we have the nearest thing to a daily schedule. Now, it's not quite that, but this is how it's mapped out in Mark's gospel. The Sunday before, which is, of course, Palm Sunday, when they were approaching Jerusalem, which is at the start of chapter 11 in Mark's gospel. Then after we've had the Palm Sunday stuff, we'll have on the following day, crops up in Mark. So you see, the way Mark tells the story in Mark 11 and Mark 12, he's actually like he's imagining a series of 5 or 6 or 7 days. So when they're approaching Jerusalem, the following day, such and such happened. The following day actually is when Jesus curses the fig tree because it wasn't bearing any fruit, even though it wasn't fig season, which is a bit tough on the poor old fig tree. Okay. Then a bit later on, in the morning, which it could be the same day, but it kind of suggests, the next day in the morning. It gets us to Tuesday, if you're counting the days. And then we get a reference saying it was 2 days before Passover. And this is where Jesus is going to send the disciples, or a couple of disciples, to go and get the room ready. Okay? On the first day of unleavened bread, it gets us to the Thursday, which is so 2 days before Passover, then the day before Passover, basically. Then we have, as soon as it was morning, which is after Jesus has been arrested, and then they're going to take him to Pilate's residence. Then there's a reference to Sabbath, when the Sabbath was over, which means there's been a day in between. And then, of course, very early on the first day of the week, women came to the tomb. So you get a kind of a weekly schedule there. Now, you don't get that anywhere else in the Gospels. Okay, this is almost like a series of diary entries. Not that anybody was keeping a diary, but it has that kind of feel to it. It's a story which is much more organised than we would normally find. Interestingly, the nearest similar thing is at the very beginning of Mark's Gospel, in Mark chapter 1 and 2, where he has Jesus' first week on the job, as it were, and he has a number of things, one after the other, the next day and the next day. You get a bit of that as well. So beginning of Mark and the end of Mark, but here it's much more specific. So the biblical story itself is told in such a way that it sort of invites us to imagine it as a week out of Jesus' diary. So, when did people start observing Holy Week? Well, it didn't happen in the time of Paul. If we think about what's going on in the first century, during Paul's lifetime, because Paul probably dies in the middle of the 60s, so Paul is dead before the Jewish revolt, before the destruction of the temple. So Paul's whole life happens while the temple is still functioning. So there was no way the Christians were going to be celebrating Holy Week and doing all that stuff in Jerusalem when the temple is still functioning and everything's going on. And then of course Jerusalem is destroyed and is rebuilt as a pagan city at the beginning of the 2nd century. And in fact, Jewish people were banned from even setting foot inside Jerusalem, sort of after the Jewish revolts in the 2nd century, the Common Era. So we've got to go down. The first time we get a reference to Holy Week, kind of, is a document called the Apostolic Constitutions, and it's like a handbook for parish priests, written about 250 to 300 AD. And it goes through and tells you how to do various kinds of things. Now, hasn't quite got a Holy Week here, but you notice he calls it the Great Week. So that's Holy Week. And the person writing this is saying Jesus himself, not true of course, but Jesus himself commanded his followers to fast for all 6 days during this week. Now, of course, Jesus didn't. This is how the tradition of the church is developing about 200 to 250 years later. Now, at this time, it's still illegal to be a Christian. Christians can be persecuted. That's all going to change. By 312, Constantine is going to be the first Christian emperor. Okay, so this is just before the time of Constantine, or maybe at the very beginning of the Emperor Constantine, because it's written towards the end of the 3rd century, beginning of the 4th century. So it's beginning to pick up the idea that you identify a period of days leading up to Good Friday and to Easter, and you tie it in with Jesus weeping over the city and about the rooster crowing in the morning and Peter remembering. So they're beginning to connect the gospel passages with the idea of a week-long solemn fast. Okay? So a very serious kind of time. including, notice, fasting on this one particular Sabbath day, because he's noting normally Sabbath is not a fast day. It's always a feasting day in the Jewish tradition. But this Sabbath, on this Sabbath only, that's the Saturday when Jesus, the Creator, was under the earth. In other words, when Jesus is buried. So the Holy Saturday becomes a fast day, even though it's a Saturday, even though it's a Shabbat, which would not normally be a fast day. So you can kind of see the idea that this is a special week where things are done differently is beginning to emerge by the end of the 3rd century. So let's have a little bit of think about Byzantine Jerusalem, because once we get to the Emperor Constantine, we talk not so much about the Roman Empire, but in fact about the sort of Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantine Empire is going to last until the capture of Constantinople, which is almost 1,000 years later. It's captured by Byzantium. It means the empire where the capital, it's the Roman Empire, what became of the Roman Empire when the capital moved from Rome to Byzantium or Constantinople or Istanbul, the same place. Okay, so the seat of power. So what's going on in the Roman Empire? Constantine becomes the emperor, and he's a Christian, but he moves the capital, the seat of power, like he's moved Parliament House, sort of, from Rome to a brand new city called Constantinopolis. In other words, Constantine City. I'll name it after myself. Like, how big is my ego? Okay? And that's in what today is Turkey. In fact, Constantinople kept that name, was also called Byzantium, but Constantinople kept that name until the late 19th century, when the sort of Ottoman Empire was going through a modernisation period with industrialisation and mechanisation, importing technology from Europe, and at that point they stopped calling it Constantinia and started to call it Istanbul. And that's the city of Istanbul to this day. So Istanbul, until 120 years ago, was called Constantinople. And it's the city built by Constantine in about 330 AD.
Someone wrote a song about that.
Yeah.
Istanbul, not Constantinople.
Yeah.
Did they? I'm not aware of that song, but there you go. So, because it for more than 1,000 years was called Constantinople, and all of a sudden it changes to Istanbul.
I identify Constantinople with Constantinople is a very big word. If you can't spell it, you're the biggest dunce in the world. And of course, people they tried to spell Constantinople, and all I asked them to do was spell it. I too.
All right, that's a little bit of oral tradition. Okay.
Sorry.
I always thought you were a nice one. Okay, so when we talk about Byzantine Jerusalem, so eventually the Roman Empire becomes called the Byzantine Empire. But really it starts with Constantine, and so the late Roman Empire and the early Byzantine Empire is sort of the same thing. Okay, with morphs. And it's about the centre of gravity, the empire moving to the east. Okay. So what was Jerusalem like once the emperor becomes Christian? Whole new ballgame. For the first 300 years, the emperor, the empire, all the official institutions are against Christianity. Now you've got an emperor who's a Christian. So the church gets the government checkbook. There's no highways for Sydney, thank you very much, but there's some really good work going on in Jerusalem. So we get Byzantine Jerusalem. And this is what's called the Madaba map. It's a map of Jerusalem in the Byzantine period, found on they built a new church on the top of it. It's now inside St. George's Church in Jordan, in a town called Madaba. And it's a map, it's a much bigger map. It's a map of the whole of the Holy Land. But the bit that we're interested in is the bit that focuses on Jerusalem. And it's not drawn to scale. So Jerusalem is like this big blob in the middle of the map. In other words, the people doing this map Jerusalem was like the centre of the universe.
How many people would live there at that time?
I actually don't know the population of Jerusalem in Byzantine period. I would think only 10, 20,000. It's not that big a place. Now, up here is what we call the Damascus Gate. Over here is the temple. You see it's all ruined, things are knocked over and so on. And the road that runs this way, because that's actually north-south, that's what's called the Cardo. And the Cardo was the main street. In a Roman city and a Greek city, the main road running north-south is called the Cardo. And it comes from cardinal direction. Lots of people will tell you it's to do with the heart, because it's the heart of the city. Wrong Greek word. It's to do with cardinal. The cardinal point was the north. So Greek cities and Roman cities were oriented north-south. That's the main road. So Jerusalem has been rebuilt in the Byzantine period as a classic Hellenistic Roman city oriented north-south. Strictly speaking, I should have flipped this image so you could get the sense that it is the other way around. But Jerusalem doesn't lend itself to being a city built on a grid because it's on a little spur. And you come into the city from the north because the hill just slopes down, but then you go onto this spur and it falls away to the east towards the Mount of Olives. It goes down to the Cathedral Valley. To the west it falls away to the Valley of Hinnom, the garbage dump that never goes out, burns night and day. And at the south, well, the south is just a little point. There's nothing there. So you couldn't, they're trying to put a classic Greek city on a piece of land that isn't square. Okay? So the best they can do is they run this major street down the middle. They have another sort of secondary road running across here. And when we're there later in the year, we'll actually walk in through the Damascus Gate and you'll see the fork in the road. There's one main road goes straight ahead and there's another main road goes off to the left. That's because that used to be a little creek and got filled in and paved. So you've got, Jerusalem has two main streets because it doesn't quite fit the geography. The left-hand street takes you to the temple, but the main street takes you to this building here. Look how it's bigger than everything else in town. Okay? And that is what we call the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And what the Greeks have always called the Church of the Resurrection. Notice the difference in focus. Is this the Church of the Holy Grave, Holy Sepulchre, or is this the Church of the Resurrection? Same place, but the mindset behind the label gives you the difference between Greek Orthodox and Roman Catholic. Okay? For the Greeks, it's about resurrection and transformation. For the Westerners, it's about death, and suffering, and burial. Okay? So this is a dirty big church, biggest building in town, and meanwhile up here, where the Jewish temple used to stand, they have left it as a ruin. Okay? They could have built a big church over there. Nope. Let's leave the temple as a rubbish dump. We won. Okay? What's there now? The Dome of the Rock, the third holiest site in Islam. Because the Christians didn't build anything there, so when the Muslims captured the city in 620, they looked around and said, well, there's some empty land over here. Why don't we build a mosque over here? Notice they did not knock down the Church of the Resurrection. They didn't take it over and turn it into a mosque. They looked for a bit of empty land and they built a mosque over there. Okay, so even the modern geography of the old city of Jerusalem is based on the Byzantine city.
Was the
Sorry.
Was the Muslims the Ottoman regime that came down and captured Israel, Jerusalem?
No. The Ottoman Empire was the last of several Islamic empires, and the Ottomans ruled from basically 1518 to 1918.
Later.
Yeah, so it's an empire that lasted 400 years. That's not a bad run. Okay, but when Jerusalem was captured, it was captured by the first wave of Islamic leaders in 620, and then you go into the Mayas and the Fatimid. You go to the sort of Fatimid. You get the Rashidun and the Umayyads and the Fatimid and so on. Whole series of Islamic dynasties. Yeah. So they didn't demolish this until around about 1000 AD, and a very extremist sultan based in Egypt, called, the Westerners call him Mad Hakim. His subjects probably were a bit more respectful, but he ordered the destruction of the Holy Sepulchre, and that was one of the triggers for the Crusades. But until then, so for 400 years or so, almost 400 years, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Church of the Resurrection, stayed intact, continued to operate. And the Byzantine Empire shrank and shrank and shrank until in the end it was just the city of Byzantium, Constantinople. That was all that was left, and finally it was captured.
When they demolished the church, was that in about 1500?
No, it was just before 1000, in the late 900s. Now, he did agree. I mean, the Byzantine emperor was really angry, and so he was deposed, and part of the peace deal was that they would allow the Byzantines to rebuild the church. Okay, so it's not as if, so it was just a particular ruler who decided Christians shouldn't have any place in the Holy Land anymore, so he wanted to destroy this church. He didn't destroy the one in Bethlehem, but he did destroy this one. But the point is, it was destroyed, and it was partly rebuilt, and when the Crusaders, so we'll come to the story in just a second, that's just another way of looking at the city. So the so-called Damascus Gate is up here, you've got the main north-south road over here, and the other little road brings you across here and brings you over to that's the area which is now the Haram Sharif. Okay? So that's what, and because it's on this spur, the valley here, the Cathedral Valley here, the Hinnom Valley here, the city couldn't be built as a square with an east-west road and a north-south road. It got kind of squeezed by the geography. Okay. Similarly, they couldn't put a big marketplace at the south end, so they put the main forum is at the northern gate, okay, what is now called the Damascus Gate, because it's the road heading north to Damascus. Okay.
So do they still call the church the Church of the Holy Sepulchre?
People from the West refer to it as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The Greek Orthodox, who are the local Christians in Palestine, for them it's the Church of the Resurrection. Still to this day.
So it was rebuilt, but only in a small scale.
Coming to that, yeah. Rebuilt, and they did so. So it gets to this. Okay, now that still looks pretty impressive. This is the actual so-called tomb of Jesus, and it's inside a rotunda, which is pretty big. I mean, you can see people down there. No, that's not people. You can see people down there. It's a pretty big space. It's only a fraction of what the church used to look like. But it was the best the Crusaders could do, given they didn't have the imperial Roman government checkbook. Okay? And they were army engineers. So the Church of the Holy Sepulchre never went back to its glory.
Or did they have the manpower? In numbers, were they greater?
Well, the Crusades were a relatively small group of soldiers from Europe who'd managed to take advantage of some weakness in the Islamic Empire, and they had captured Jerusalem and held the Muslims at bay for, in total, about 100 years. Okay, but they were always at the far end of a very long supply chain. Okay, so any reinforcements had to either walk around or come by boat. It was never going to work. You can't, without modern technology, you can't maintain that kind of thing. But the church was originally like this. So here's the main road running north-south, the main steps. And those steps still exist. They're behind a sweet shop in the old city. You can still, if you know the owner, you can still get to see the steps. And then there was a large colonnaded building called the Martyrium, the place of witness. Okay? And then at the far end there was a courtyard, an open courtyard, where you had a piece of rock, big spur of natural rock, which is said to be the rock of Calvary. That was out in the open air. And then beyond that, you went to this large structure covered by a dome, which is the so-called anastasis or resurrection, the empty tomb. Now, a little trivial point, the dome on the Dome of the Rock is exactly the same size as the dome on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. One's covered with gold, the other's covered with grey paint. Okay, so which one looks more special? The gold is fairly recent. Okay, so that's what it was like in the Byzantine period. So you've got this main street, you've got this huge auditorium with columns and it's like 3 or 4 stories high. You've got this open courtyard where the main thing was the rock on which the cross had stood, according to the tradition. And then beyond that you had this rotunda, inside of which was supposedly the empty tomb. Okay? So just to give you another sense, so this is what it looked like. Here's the Martyrium, 3 or 4 stories high, in fact, probably 5 stories high. Here's the rock of Calvary, the open courtyard, and that's what we've got today is a scaled down version of that I showed you a couple of minutes ago. So this picture here is what this looks like today, okay? And the rock of Calvary is still there, but now the building, this open courtyard, has been completely closed in. So the point of all that is to say that in the early 4th century, the government, the new Christian government of the Roman Empire, was spending up big to make Jerusalem a Christian theme park. That's not their language, of course, but that's what they were doing. So Queen Saint Helena, the emperor's mother, with her son's checkbook, came out to Palestine. She travelled up and down Palestine looking for holy sites. And once they were shown to her, she would authorise the building of a church. Well, guess what? Palestinians found every holy site she was looking for and gave her a receipt for the checkbook, for the check. So she commissioned the church in Bethlehem, she commissioned the church in Jerusalem, and so on. This was the emperor's mum on a spending trip, building monuments to the Christian story. Okay? Including, of course, the legend that they found the cross on which Jesus was crucified, the so-called finding of the true cross, which is Holy Cross Day, September 14, which is our anniversary of dedication of the cathedral, September 14, Holy Cross Day.
Did the churches deliberately choose a special day to, say, celebrate something really important, like we're saying here?
I don't know why in our case, why did they choose to lay the foundation stone on the Feast of St. James when it's not St. James Cathedral, it's Christchurch Cathedral? Okay. Probably the bishop was available that day. That's probably the reason why the cathedral was founded on the 25th of July. And similarly, they were ready to do the consecrate, when the thing was finished in 1934-35, they're ready to consecrate it or dedicate it. They chose September 14, not July 25. And 9.
Actually, only last Friday, a man came in and said, why was the cathedral consecrated on the date it was, when it was built?
Yeah.
Why
Well,
did
two
they
things are going on. When they built it originally, it only went halfway,
Yes.
and that's what they blessed and opened on the 25th of July. 50 years later, as a happy birthday present for the cathedral, we put the rest of it in place. And for some reason, they chose to do the cathedral dedication on the 14th of September rather than the 25th of 1959. Do you not remember?
No.
I remember 1959, but I don't know why.
I was, but actually this man asked the question I couldn't answer. I didn't know.
It
what
may be in John Morehouse's book
Yeah.
as to why that date was chosen.
I
I
must
don't know
read
what
it
it
up.
was.
Yeah.
And it probably came down to they didn't quite have it finished by July. Could have been what it was, because that would have been the obvious thing, to do it on the 25th of July. They didn't quite make it, so they looked for another special day and said, let's do it on Holy Cross Day. What's so special about Holy Cross Day? Well, according to the legend, that's the day when Queen Helena found the Holy Cross, which proved for her mind that this was the site of the crucifixion. Now they found, according to the legend, they found a pit, and in the pit were 3 crosses. So which one is, so assuming one of them is the cross of Jesus, bit of an assumption. Okay. How do you work out which one is Jesus? Well, you get a dead person, you drag their body across, you lie it on the first cross, still dead. You lie it on the second cross, still dead. You put the corpse on the third cross, he comes back to life. That must be the cross of Jesus. Okay? Now, would you like to buy a bridge? Because I have a bridge available as well. You can see what's happening. The church is making up stuff because it brings the pilgrims. Okay? So, September 14, I mean, leaving aside the fact that the kind of cross they say they found is not the kind of cross they would have been using in the first century. Jesus was not crucified on a large capital T. That's not what the cross looked like in the first century. So yeah, there are all sorts of reasons why that's just legend. Okay? But that's what's going on here. So what they claim to have, round about, oops, sorry, wrong. What they claim to have, let me think, that's across the Calvary. So round about here, they've got the sort of what's called the Chapel of the True Cross, and then you've got the Rock of Calvary, and over here you've got what used to be a cave. Now, how do you turn a cave, which is what the tomb was, how do you turn a cave into a building? Like, how do you shift a hole from here and put the hole over there? How do you do that? Alec, you're our... You're our... Well, what they did was,
Cut and paste.
over here there was a natural body of rock coming down, and in the side of that rock were a number of tombs. In fact, several of them are still there. So when we go there in December, I'll take you into the back corner through a back door, and there are still several first century tombs in the bedrock. Okay? So the bedrock originally came right down here. And what they've done is, they want to venerate the cave where Jesus was buried. But if they cut away all the rock, and all they have is the hole, it's not going to work, is it? So you don't cut away all the rock, you cut away most of the rock, and you leave a hunk of rock here, which you then carve to make it look like a house. And it's what's called the edicule, or the tomb of Jesus. Okay? So that little building we saw earlier, this thing, that is supposedly part of the native rock from the first century. In fact, that's not, that's all modern stuff from the last few hundred years. But right down inside, yes, there is bedrock from forever, but there is, and they did a big restoration job on this while I was in Jerusalem, and they're quite confident that what we've got here is in fact a stone tomb from the first century, on top of which a structure has been put and has been destroyed and replaced several times. Okay? But at the base of this, there is the footprint of the original stone cave in a hunk of stone where the burial would have happened. Okay? Anyway, that's what the other end was. So this is a whole different food chain kind of scenario. When the Crusaders come, they're not able to rebuild all that. But even staying in the Byzantine period, this is this is what Holy Week is looking like. There was a lady called Egeria. She was a pilgrim, came to Palestine. As you can see, she was travelling in the area for 3 years, from 381 to 384. She kept a diary, and then she was, I think, a nun, which is how she got to be free to travel, because if she was a married woman with kids, her husband would not have allowed her to go to Jerusalem for 3 years. It meant that's not going to happen in the 4th century. So as she finishes her journey, she writes an account of all the places she went and all the church services she went to. So actually, this is an eyewitness account of what was going on in Byzantine Jerusalem around about 380 AD. Okay? Now, don't worry about all that. That's just giving you the whole week of it. So you can see there is some detail here. The summary looks like this. On Lazarus Saturday, interesting, the day before Palm Sunday, they celebrated the Lazarus story. Okay? Because Lazarus being raised from the dead is a sign of Jesus being raised from the dead. The next day they have Palm Sunday, and they gather on the Mount of Olives and they come down waving palm branches. This is 1600 years ago. Okay? Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday there were special vigil services in the Martyrium, which is that big long entrance hall at the Church of the Resurrection. Late on Thursday there's a vigil at the Eleona Church. Now the Eleona Church has been destroyed and rebuilt. It's now called the Paternoster Church. But the Eleona Church, and that's a Greek word meaning olives. So it's a church on the Mount of Olives in the Garden of Gethsemane. And there was a cave there. Well, there are caves everywhere through the hills in Jerusalem and up through the middle of Israel. But of course, the cave just next to the Eleona Church was believed to be the cave where Jesus had prayed before he was arrested. Now, there's no cave in the Gospels, but we've got a cave. We want the pilgrims to come, so this is the cave Jesus prayed in while the disciples went to sleep. So on Thursday night, they'd go and have a vigil at the Eleona Church, at the cave, where Jesus had been on Thursday night before his arrest. On Friday, there was a whole series of vigils at Golgotha. Golgotha is the hunk of rock in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre where the cross stood, according to the tradition. Okay? It's still there today. And then on Saturday was a fasting day and a vigil at the Martyrium. And then, of course, on Saturday night, Sunday morning would be the Easter celebrations, where they'd light the holy fire and do all the stuff we're going to do in a couple of weeks' time. Okay? So this is around about 380. This is the routine. Now, this is not happening anywhere else in Christianity. It's only happening in Jerusalem. So if you go to church in Rome, you're not going to know about this stuff. If you go to church in Canterbury, well, you'll be pushing it in 300 or something, but anyway, if you were to go to a church in France or Spain or whatever, you won't be doing this. Holy Week was what happened in Jerusalem. Okay? Because this is where the places are. And similar, two Easters ago, maybe it's almost, I guess almost 3 Easters ago now, we're at St. George's Cathedral. Mighty Thursday, we did the washing of the feet and we did the stripping of the altar, and we all walked around to the Garden of Gethsemane, because you can, because you're in Jerusalem. Okay. All right. So then the Crusaders come along. We've talked about them already. They do what they can to kind of reassemble and make good the damage. They're doing a sort of reno job, like the block. But they've got a very limited budget. So what they do is they shrink the church. They figure, no way we're going to be able to do the Martyrium and the entrance on the main street. It's just too big a job. So the Church of the Holy Sepulchre becomes just the rock of Golgotha and the tomb, okay, the edicule. And that's what you now have, basically, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Church of the Resurrection. So the church has shrunk. And it's shrunk in height as well as shrinking in size, because they just don't have the budget and the manpower to rebuild what the Roman Empire built. Crusaders are fixated on the true cross. And they wanted to recover the true cross. It was like a lucky charm par excellence. Okay, so they had to get the true cross back from Muslims. And that's why Holy Cross Day, the 14th of September, became really important back in Europe, because the Crusaders brought back to Europe what they had discovered when they were in Palestine. So Holy Cross Day becomes a big deal from the Crusaders onward. It didn't exist really prior to the Crusades. And they were absolutely convinced that Queen Helena found it and all the rest. If you had the Holy Cross, or even a piece of the Holy Cross, you would always be blessed. They also invented the Via Dolorosa, the way of the cross. And it's based on the streets in Jerusalem around about 1000 AD. It's not based on the streets in Jerusalem 1,000 years earlier. Okay, so it reflects the Byzantine configuration of Jerusalem. And it's probably totally wrong in terms of where it begins. But that's where it begins. It's been like that for 1,000 years now, so you can't change it. Okay? So this idea of the Via Dolorosa, or the way of the cross, and see, it's all about the suffering, the way of sadness, the way of sorrow, Via Dolorosa. The Crusaders were into death and suffering and blood, because they were soldiers far from home, dying of disease and wounds and so on. And they brought back from Europe the latest liturgical practices from Jerusalem. So Holy Week and Holy Cross Day and all those things begin to be observed in medieval Europe in the post-Crusader period. Okay.
Were the Crusades from a collection of countries, and how did they have some unified objective?
Crusades kick off, I don't have the exact dates in my head, but a little bit before 1000 AD. The Pope calls on the people of Europe to rise up and go and reclaim the Holy Sepulchre from the Muslims. And they've destroyed the most important church in the world, kind of thing. And he offered plenary indulgences for everybody who participated. In other words, you're guaranteed a place in heaven. So when we think about sort of Muslim extremists who think if they die on jihad, they become martyrs, shadi, and they're guaranteed a place in heaven with the dark-eyed virgins, it's the same gig that the Catholic Church was offering 1,000 years earlier. Okay? What do men want? Well, we'll offer it to them. Works every time. So the Crusades arrived supposedly to help the barely surviving Emperor of Byzantium to reclaim his empire. But so many naval ships turned up and so many soldiers turned up that the Emperor of Byzantium quickly realised that he was going to lose his empire to the Europeans. So he basically said, nothing to see here, why don't you go down to Jerusalem? And he shoved them all off from Constantinople. So he didn't want all these soldiers and sailors and warships in the harbour in Constantinople, thank you very much. So he sent them off to Palestine to sort of go get the Holy Sepulchre back from the Muslims. Okay, so officially they're there helping the Byzantine emperor to regain Jerusalem from his empire. Of course, they took the view that anybody who looked vaguely Arab must be a Muslim. So they killed Christians and Muslims alike. They didn't distinguish between Palestinian Christians and Muslims. They just killed everybody that they found. There was an initial success, and you get the first, second, third Crusades. These became increasingly ineffective. Because famously, Richard the Lionheart was one of the Crusades, was captured by Saladin and was imprisoned in Akko for a period of time until he was ransomed, allowed to go back to England. Meanwhile, Robin Hood and King John are chasing each other around the forests of Nottinghamshire and so on. So this is the cultural context for the latter period of the Crusades. The Crusades very quickly became a very corrupt and fragile regime. And in the end, Salah ad-Din, who we call Saladin, but Salah ad-Din means healer of religion. He was going to restore true faith. So Salah ad-Din, Saladin. He was beaten by the Christian king, Baldwin, several times, and they had a peace treaty, but the Christian king kept breaking the peace treaty and building castles closer and closer to Damascus. Okay, so eventually Saladin said, this is not working, and he attacked the castle, and it had just been finished, destroyed the castle, destroyed Baldwin's army, and then he was on a roll, and he went all the way to Jerusalem, which is in the the late 11, in the 1190s. So it's a story. It's a horrible story of intrigue and cheating and lying and bad diplomacy and all the rest. In the end, the Crusaders are expelled, and the Christians who are left go into a much more difficult period of time in the empires that follow. But liturgically, what's happened is the stories coming back to Europe is we should be doing in Salisbury what they're doing in Jerusalem. That would be a jolly good thing, don't you think? So the idea of Holy Week and so on, Holy Cross Day and so on, these became very powerful in Western Europe. So let's just quickly go through the days very, very quickly. So Palm Sunday, of course, is the official kick-off of Holy Week in the West, and it is also in the East as well. And it marks the arrival of Jesus in Jerusalem, the beginning of the Passion Week. Typically, it's marked with the blessing of palms, a procession of some sort, even if it's just from the front steps into the church. Some churches, they'll do a procession around the church. Different places, different times, people would have done things differently. At different times in Grafton, for instance, would have been possible for the Catholics and Anglicans to meet together for the blessing of the palms, then they each process to their own church for the separate liturgy. So you would have seen some of these variations. That really depends on the goodwill between the two parish priests more than anything else. But in other words, Catholic and Anglicans tend to do the same stuff. And it also includes the first time in Holy Week when we read the account of the Last Supper and the betrayal and the arrest and the trial, the crucifixion. That's Palm Sunday. Then we have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. We saw that in Byzantine Jerusalem, these were days for vigil. And so some places try to come up with a theme for Monday and for Tuesday and for Wednesday. But, and different deeds over the years, you might have had that kind of practice. What we're going to be doing this year is we're going to have Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday. There will be a morning Eucharist. It's also a time for people just to be prayerful and quiet and not fussing around doing stuff. It's not really a time to go and watch movies and go to opera. There's really much opera in Gradton, but it's a time to be solemn and focused rather than, it's not party time. It's very solemn week. And this year we're having a series of teaching sermons at evening prayer, which will be done by Bishop Murray, as I mentioned in church. So we use the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday to be quiet, to be reflective, to kind of begin to really pay attention to what's going on in the week. Monday, Thursday evening, we have what's called the Mass of the Last Supper, or the Liturgy of the Lord's Supper, and that's where we're reenacting the foot washing, but we're also commemorating the institution of the Eucharist on Monday, Thursday, back in the year 30. So it's a mix of things. It's like, this is the birthday for the Eucharist kind of thing, with the Last Supper account. So we have, the colours change to white, and it's a more, sort of begins as a much more celebratory event. We have the feet washing. Again, it's one of those times when we actually reenact, to some extent, the story from the Bible. It's easier to reenact feet washing, not tougher to reenact crucifixion or resurrection. At the end of the service, remember, the mood changes, and we go from celebration to the sense of being betrayed and abandoned. So the way we mark that is the lights go down, and we strip the altar. We take all the candles and altar cloths. So by the time that's finished, it's just a bare table. And the idea is to represent Jesus being abandoned in the Garden of Gethsemane. That's the idea of that ritual. Not exactly a reenactment, but it's a ritual action to commemorate Jesus being abandoned. And then, again, different parishes do it different ways. There'll be an hour, or there'll be 3 hours, or there'll be 12 hours of people sitting in the church quietly praying, keeping a vigil. Could you not watch with me even for 1 hour? Okay, so we tend to have a 1 hour vigil after the service ends on Maundy Thursday. And then we get to Good Friday, which of course is the commemoration of the Passion. And every Eucharist is, of course, a commemoration of the cross and resurrection. But this is the day when we commemorate the death of Jesus. So the liturgy is very solemn, but it tends to be very simple. Everything is stripped down to the bare essentials from the previous night. We read the Passion narrative from John's Gospel, whereas on Palm Sunday we read it from Matthew, Mark and Luke. There'll be some kind of veneration of the cross, so the major symbol for the liturgy is the cross. Different parishes do that different ways. We invite people to come up and stand quietly in front of the cross, just saying their own prayers and so on. And some parishes, there are different ways of doing this. Some parishes will not have communion at all on Good Friday. Other parishes, and I think this had been the tradition until I came here, keep some of the bread and wine from the previous night, and they have communion from the reserved sacrament on Good Friday. And what I like to do is actually to celebrate the Eucharist, but do it in a very low-key way, very subdued, because the Eucharist is the commemoration of the cross. So again, there are different traditions. And then the service just ends. The service ends in silence. There's no blessing at the end. People just move away quietly. Okay. And we come to Easter Eve. Now this is what the Holy Sepulchre looks like in Jerusalem on the morning, on a Saturday morning. Okay, there are thousands of people in there, and they're all going to light a bundle of 30 candles. 33 candles probably. They've got bunches of little thin candles. And when the holy fire comes out of the tomb of Jesus, the Greek patriarch, okay, so he'll be there. He's in his script search. He's patted down, meant to make sure he doesn't have any matches or cigarette lighters with him. He goes into the tomb of Jesus, and a few minutes later he comes out with the holy fire, which has miraculously appeared. Okay? And then it's spread almost instantly around the church. There's just one person to the other, and almost all the oxygen is sucked out of the place for a few seconds, because there are thousands and thousands of candles that are suddenly using up the oxygen. So we're a little bit more, we're a simplified version of that. So we'll have a little barbecue out on the cathedral steps, and we'll light a fire, and we'll light the Easter candle, but it's not that. But it's inspired by that. It's a kind of, it's recognising fire as one of the primary elements of human culture. We light the Paschal candle. The Paschal, of course, just a fancy word for Easter. It comes from the Hebrew Passover, Pesach, which in Greek became Pascha, and in English becomes Paschal. There's the Easter proclamation, the great announcement of Christ is risen. Often the renewal of baptism vows will happen in that service, and then the first Eucharist of Easter. Now, it's not as popular in people's minds as the Christmas Midnight Mass, but it's kind of the equivalent of Midnight Mass, but it happens around 7 o'clock. Never really caught on in the way that Midnight Mass has people. I guess Santa's not coming in the morning. Not quite the same.
Greggy is saying that they're going
At Easter, there's no midnight service. This happens around 7 p.m., just after dark. Again, people do it different ways. You can have it at midnight. You can also have it at dawn, just before dawn, with the idea that as the sun comes up, the candles are being lit and so on. So there are slightly different ways of doing it. Our pattern here seems to be to do it around about 7 o'clock on Saturday night, which this year should be dark. I think last year it was still pretty light at 7 o'clock because of Easter moving around. And then, of course, there's Easter Day. So again, this is just a picture from the tomb of Christ, of the Holy Sepulchre. But Easter Day, of course, it's the day of resurrection, which in the Eastern world, in the Jewish world, in the Greek Orthodox world, Easter Day starts at sunset on the Saturday. That's why we do the vigil on the Saturday night. So, and that's the reason for sort of Christmas Eve. So it's the day of resurrection. This is when the Alleluias come back into play, of course, including the night before. The great Easter proclamation, Christ is risen. He's risen indeed. Again, often there's baptisms, renewal of baptism vows. If there are adults being baptised and confirmed, this is the perfect time to do that. And then, of course, you've got the great Eucharist of Easter, which actually is in theory, the Easter Eucharist is like the number one liturgy of the year. It's meant to be the creme de la creme of liturgical events. This is where the church, depending on its resources, will put on the best show it can in terms of music, investments, and whatever else. Okay, now finishing up with this icon, it's actually a modern version of the traditional Greek Orthodox Anastasis icon. Across the top you've got Hey Anastasis, which is the Greek for the resurrection. Okay? And this is the sort of traditional iconography for Easter. And so in this icon, Jesus is emerging from the grave. It's all very stylized, as icons are. He's emerged from the grave, and down the bottom, notice below him, in the darkness, there are broken chains and unlocked padlocks. See the symbolism? In other words, Jesus has set everybody free. There are no more chains, there are no more padlocks. Hell is empty. Sheol, Hades, has been plundered. Okay? Now you always have these two figures. Notice he's grabbing them by the hand and he's lifting them up out of Hades. Who are those people?
You and I.
Close.
Oh,
The people, not the people who have done.
Two individuals, a bloke and a woman, who are being lifted up from their coffins, from Sheol. No, this is Jesus in the middle.
I'm the what's his name? The one that betrayed.
No. Think further back. Think Adam and Eve, which is all of us. So in the iconography, Jesus, who's the second Adam, rescues the first Adam from death. Okay, so these icons are very carefully constructed theological statements. Over on the side, you've got John the Baptist pointing to Jesus, as he does, because he's the forerunner. He has to do his stuff. And then you've got Moses and Elijah, the law and the prophets from the Old Testament. And on the other side, you've got presumably Peter and Paul, and you've also got a young boy in a sort of linen cloth. And in Mark's Gospel, there's a young man in a linen cloth who's following them after the arrest, and the police try to grab him, and he runs away, leaving his little linen cloth behind, runs off naked into the darkness. So, what's all that about? We have no idea. But yeah, he's back. This one he's got his clothes back on, and he's there as well. Okay. So, and when another part of the mythology, if you like, the symbolism of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is the rock of Calvary, it's called Golgotha, that piece of rock it's got a great crack through it, which is actually why it's left there, because they couldn't use it for building. So it was a bit of junk rock. Okay. Now in the tradition, Jesus is crucified on top of that rock, and his blood runs down and trickles down the crack, because they believe Adam was buried underneath the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Of course he wasn't. But that's the symbolic story of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. That why was it called the place of the skull? Because it's the place where Adam was buried. This is how religious imagination works. You take a name, and there's got to be a reason for that name. There must be somebody's skull there. If it's called the place of the skull, who's the most important person that could be there? Well, Adam, of course.
Could it be possible?
Well, no, because Adam's not a historical figure, for starters. Secondly, Jerusalem was nowhere near the Garden of Eden, which is also not a historical place. But I mean, no, there is no Adam and Eve. We know that from science. We come from Africa. That's where humans come from. So the Adam and Eve story is the story set in the Middle East, but it's not the story we know from science about where humans come from. Yeah. So no, Adam is not buried under the rock of the Holy Sepulchre. But you can see if it's a holy place, then it's like a bit of spiritual magnet, and all kinds of other stories get gathered to it. And so the Church of the Holy Sepulchre becomes the church where the first Adam is given life by the second Adam. And that's the sort of symbolic language that's being used in the architecture of the church as well. Yeah. So these are beautiful stories, but not to be confused for actual events. They're beautiful poetic stories.